Welcome to Backlash Unfiltered, a podcast series by Unrest. Through in-depth conversations with leading scholars, activists, and policymakers, we will explore the rise of anti-gender movements, their impact on social development, and the historical and geopolitical forces that sustain them. This series is not just about understanding the backlash. It is also about resilience and imagining a fairer future.
Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of Backlash Unfiltered. My name is Francisco Cosmontiel, and I am the coordinator of the Gender Justice and Development Program at UNRIST. It is a real pleasure to welcome Professor Clare Hemmings, Professor of Feminist Theory at the Gender Department of the London School of Economics. Her work, and I would say her mentorship, has influenced many generations of feminist thinkers. Her progressive agenda has been praised by many scholars around the world. So it is a real pleasure to have you.
It's a real pleasure to talk with you, Francisco.
Thank you, Claire. And I will start by asking that you have led the research project and network for transnational anti-gender movements and resistance. Please tell us more about this initiative.
So it was co-run by myself and Professor Sumi Madhok, also in the gender department at LSE, and it was Arts and Humanities Research Council funded for September 2022 to March 2024, so for 18 months. And it brought together 30 advisory committee members from across the world to provide support for them in their engagements with anti-gender movements and to track the overlaps where possible in anti-gender movements and resistance in particular. And some of the successes were that there was an enormous interest in trying to come together to think about how to challenge anti-gender movements globally. So there was amazing participation in the conferences, 1,000 people at big events, smaller workshops, and so on. But of course, in the end, in 18 months, we could only really scratch the surface of what it is that unites us, the different kinds of anti-gender mobilizations transnationally, and of course, and I know we'll talk about this, what to do about it.
Exactly. And now that you mentioned this transnational context, how do you interpret the current backlash against women's and LGBTQIA plus rights in the global context? What is your interpretation? What is happening?
I think that anti-gender movements have to be seen in the context of the rise of the right wing or anti-democratic movements more generally, transnationally. And so I'm thinking here of Alyosha Tudor and Miriam Ticktin's work, Sexuality and Borders in Right-Wing Times, which identifies the significance of gender and sexuality for increased surveillance of borders and for increased nationalisms globally. And I think that gender and sexuality work well as a common focus that brings together otherwise disparate forces for a range of reasons, really, that lots of other people, including Sonia Correa, for example, have really flagged over the last 5 or 6 decades even. And one is, I think, that sexuality and gender are building blocks for nation, along with race, ethnicity, and religion. And they're also building blocks for family, of course. And so in a backlash against sexual and gendered rights and freedoms, women's and LGBTQI rights are seen as challenges to the foundations of nation and family. I think attacks on feminist one and queer one rights are also attacks on migrant rights, for example, particularly in a nationalist frame, with this figure of the interloper being positioned as a threat also to family and nation, as a racialized threat as well as a sexualized or gendered threat. So I think that gender and sexuality contain a lot of information and possibilities for being taken up by forces that focus on threat to nation and family. I think I probably wouldn't use the language of backlash always, because of the different ways in which gender and sexuality circulate currently, because of the different transnational dimensions and histories where rights haven't been evenly distributed. And also, I think, because of the ways gender and sexual equality can be and are being weaponized as part of military violence and nationalist surveillance. So I'm thinking here, of course, of the ways in which the Israeli state might take up gendered and sexual equality as something that belongs to Israel as part of an argument for the rightness of attacks on Palestine or on Gaza. So I think it's complicated that the backlash on the one hand is also paralleled or coupled with a kind of cynical and violent use of gender and sexual equality as well.
Do you see any significant regional differences in these movements? Any societal or cultural characteristics in these regional differences?
I think it partly depends. It's partly state by state, isn't it? In the sense that I think these right-wing, often, not always, movements, some of the differences might be where populism is at such a height that you have a link between anti-women, anti-LGBTQI movements and a kind of anti-state move, an anti-democratic move somewhere. Well, I think we see that so specifically in the US, but also historically in Brazil, with a kind of Bolsonaro attack on state infrastructure and support and so on. But I think you can also see it in contexts of state-run attacks. So I'm thinking of some parts of Nordic context where the state is also very important in its kind of challenges and rolling back of feminist provision and so on. But I think a lot also depends on the histories of LGBTQI and feminist evolution. So there may not always be very established movements, or they may have come and gone. So there may be longer histories of movements. The emphasis might be different. So LGBT people might be specific targets. I'm thinking here recently, of course, about Hungary. Or trans people might be specific targets in more regional contexts or country contexts than others at the moment in the UK or in Brazil. While you might have more of a targeting of feminist social movements in India and Pakistan, say, or gender studies as a field as a whole in France or Sweden. So I suppose that who is targeted might be different depending on where you are. And similarly, I guess, and I'm thinking here as well of Billy Holtzberg, Aiko Holvikivi, and Thomas Hierda's book Transnational Anti-Gender Movements, which I think makes clear that when you think about different regions, you're also thinking about different origins of what you're describing as a backlash, because, of course, there's been a lot of work on the history of anti-feminist movements and anti-gender movements as religious, as having a religious origin, obviously in terms of the Vatican, but equally you can have some anti-feminist movements, for example, in China, that emerge out of political pressure rather than out of religious pressure as such. Or you might end up having some contexts where you have a combination, like Poland, where you have a political and religious attack on gender equality and LGBTQI equality. And then I'm thinking too that in some places, Argentina and Spain, for example, the social structures and infrastructures in post-dictatorship contexts, and here I'm thinking of Marcos Aurelio Prado's work in Brazil too, where those social structures post-dictatorship have never been fully dismantled. So you have a very strong surveillance structure, which is being repurposed for migration surveillance, but also for surveillance of education contexts in terms of providing opportunities for telling tales on teachers and for challenging gender ideology, for what's called gender ideology, in institutional contexts. And at the moment, we don't have that infrastructure, for example, in the UK, though, you know, anything can change. So I suppose that's another reason for thinking or putting a question mark next to the term backlash, because it really depends on the extent to which those contexts have been established already and what the different origins are and mechanisms for challenging those rights might be.
Claire, 5 years ago, we were in the middle of the lockdown due to the COVID pandemic, and we expected that after that we would improve some aspects of life, like an increase in health or in public services, recognition of care work. But we have seen quite the opposite. We have seen the concentration of huge income in a few hands that now have a lot of political power. We haven't seen an increase, but a decrease in health budgets. And we see a return of the idea of women to a very conservative view. Do you find any connections between what happened in the pandemic, like some fertile soil for what is happening now?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. I think that there probably was an opportunity presented, right, to make decisions in unaccountable ways. And to insist as well on the household as a unit, of course, that people were forced into retreating to, and interesting, of course, that the response to the pandemic emphasized a normative household as the basis of a single unit in ways that we hadn't seen for a very long time. And so I think that certainly underwrote the re-traditionalization of the family as a kind of as the central and only unit of the state. So, of course, there were some other forms of association, but those were the exception rather than the rule. I think that certainly while we were in lockdown in the UK, various forms of legislation, including challenges to trans rights, were passed while people were in effect trying to deal with the extremely high loss of life and grief and so on. So I think that I'm not sure. I think that it's directly related, but I think that it probably, I would hazard that it was an opportunistic context that enabled increased powers of the state in certain contexts, and also a reification of the family form. I think also that certainly it's made things worse in part because of the failure of being able to fund a state health response adequately. And so again, certainly in the UK, the NHS has not recovered. I mean, it was already on its knees, and now it's, you know, lying on a bed in a corridor, you know, because in the end, those demands on this failing infrastructure were also horrifically high. And because the government argument was always to try and pretend it wasn't as bad as it was, that form of funding was you know, not adequate to what was needed. And of course, the privatization of services also was accelerated during COVID globally, and so allowed for a kind of, I think, an accelerated privatization of health and welfare provision, right?
As we approach the end of this podcast, I would like to ask you, what do you see as the most urgent area of intervention or research to counter these movements? How do we push back to end on a positive note?
Well, I think we need to be networked effectively, more effectively, and keep talking to one another about the best ways of pushing back, because that's obviously something that people involved in the backlash know very well how to do. I think that the resistance always has to be transnational, in a context of anti-democratic movements that challenges the law, the state, and individual actors. So always has a kind of understanding of the relationships between the different levels of engagement. I think that probably really important is that resistance needs to refuse very popular narratives of fragmentation, that somehow identity politics has caused the fragmentation on the left that is needed to push back against the right, for example, and in fact embrace the plurality of resistance movements, and emphasize solidarity, because otherwise you end up with the pitting of interests against one another, which allows for single issue groups to be picked off, right? And I think we need to be able to be brave and call these movements out as part of neo-fascist mobilizations that are straightforwardly vicious, in that sense, ideological, rather than having arguments as though there was a way of saying, oh, well, on the one hand, you think this, and on the other, we think this, because one can have that argument with certain people, but I also think that there's an acceleration that means that while we're trying to have conversations with people in rational ways, a lot of other forms of violence are happening that you know, intellectuals particularly are not very skilled at managing. So, because I think that the anti-intellectualism of the backlash is also a very strong part of it, and that might require a bit different tactics to the ones that I at least am more used to using. Right? What do you do in the face of pure ideology and anti-intellectualism, when that's those are some of the key ways in which they work? So I suppose probably very important is trying to work out effective outcome-based strategies, so that ones that seek to change outcomes at local or regional levels, or transnationally, but local or regional probably is the most effective, and using strategies that can counter anti-gender and anti-LGBT movements and mobilizations at those levels. I have to say I'm not quite sure what the best effective strategies are for that, because also, of course, what I do know though is that's that's an enormous amount of work, right? Because of the number of people that one needs to talk with and against. What strategies do you think we need, Francisco?
It's important to do alliances with other movements. I would say, for example, with pro-democracy politicians, with progressive trade unions,
Yes.
with even progressive people in the private sector that could lead to also some resources, with progressive foundations that might provide the funding. I don't think this is a battle that we can win ourselves. Those working in the gender field, in the feminist field, in the LGBT. So I think that some of the alliances, because as you mentioned, Claire, at the beginning of the podcast, this is part of a fascist agenda, no, that threatens democracy.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right about the need for also working with agencies like unions that also have a long history of safeguarding rights or trying to, and have enormous networks of and histories of tactics that need sharing, right?
Absolutely. Thank you, Claire. It has been a real pleasure to have Professor Clare Hemmings of the Gender Department from the London School of Economics in this episode. Thank you very, very much, Professor Hemmings.
Thank you, Francisco.
And that's all for today's episode of Backlash Unfiltered, pushing forward for equality in times of change. For more information and resources, check the links in the podcast description. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.